الله الرحمن الرحيم نحمده ونسلم على رسوله الكريم أما بعد. Hope everyone is doing well. So this is our lesson 6, and in lesson 6 we'll be discussing تقسيم المسائل, which is the division of the masail in the Hanafi madhab into ظاهر رواية, نوادر, and فتاوى مشايخ. We will be having a subsequent lesson in the future which will kind of go through a key text in the madhab, but this is going to be outside of the current three that we'll be discussing. And taqsim al-masail is very important, this very base division of the masail in the Hanafi madhab, because there is a hierarchy in terms of strength of attribution back to Imam Abu Hanifa, because the purpose of the madhab, or when we say Hanafi madhab, the idea is to say, what does Imam Abu Hanifa think about this given issue? If Imam Abu Hanifa was here, what would be his opinion? That's the notion of a madhab when ascribed to a given individual. So if that's the case, then not every attribution, not every book or every mas'ala is of the same weight when it comes back to attribution back to Imam Abu Hanifa. So this now, because in the previous lessons we were looking at a more historical phenomena, and they do of course play a role in helping us understand fiqh, but now what we're kind of moving on to is far more, it will directly impact the way one does fiqh, the way one approaches these texts. So for example, if you're studying Lubab, or if you've studied Hidayah, Al-Ikhtiyar, or any text, you're doing lengthier texts like Radd al-Muhtar, or you're reading researches, there's a research come out on a given issue, then for you to know how strong this mas'ala is within the Hanafi madhab, having a base understanding of taqsim al-masail, to say, okay, this conclusion you've got, where did it originate from? Right? Did it originate from Zahiri riwayah? Did it come from Nawadir? Did it come from the Fatawa of the Mashayikh? Or is this from a later mujtahid who has done some sort of qiyas, or found some similarity between what they are saying and what comes in one of these three sources, right? Or is it just another mujtahid comes along and this is their opinion? That's what we that now becomes very important, because the weight in which we ascribe something as being Hanafi would base upon where it stems up into the hierarchy of masail. So the very base hierarchies, we're going to have two hierarchies we discuss. In this lesson we'll be discussing the hierarchy of the masail of the early madhab, and then we'll be discussing the hierarchy of the mujtahids inshallah in the subsequent lesson. So that's what we'll be looking at today inshallah. So our first segment, and this may go into two segments depending on how much we can cover, is the discussion regarding ظاهر riwayah. Right, ظاهر riwayah. In recent times, there's been a very useful book written by Sheikh Lu'ay al-Khalili, which is known as أسباب العدول. The name of the book is أسباب العدول الحنفية عن الفتية بظاهر رواية, which basically looks at those cases within the Hanafi madhab where fatwa is given against the ظاهر رواية. But in the beginning of this book, he does discuss the notion of ظاهر رواية and what that is. So ظاهر رواية, also other terms that are used is like Masail al-Usul. So you may find these terms used in the books of Hanafi fiqh. So when you find someone say كما في ظاهر رواية, what does that refer to? So in the previous lesson we did touch upon this, is that ظاهر رواية are the books written by Imam Muhammad. They are the books written by Imam Muhammad, which have been transmitted by a number of Hanafi scholars, and this is mashhur as being the position of Imam Abu Hanifa and his companions. Right, so this has been transmitted by a generation, and it's well established that this is the position of Imam Abu Hanifa and his companions. So those books that he writes, Imam Muhammad, for this purpose, right, and be transmitted as such, they are known as ظاهر riwayah, and they make up the base of the Hanafi madhab. So if you, as a rule of thumb, if a mas'ala comes in ظاهر riwayah, then default rule is that fatwa is given on it. To not give fatwa on Zahiri riwayah, there has to be a strong case. Usually, the fatwa is no longer given Zahiri riwayah because of either the initial fatwa was based on urf, and the urf has changed. There could be some form of haj and darura where the original mas'ala is no longer applicable, so the hukm has to change. And other such factors in which the fatwa is not given on Zahiri riwayah. Otherwise, the default is if your position is found in the Zahiri riwayah, then this is what the madhab is, because this is the strongest source that we have back to Imam Abu Hanifa. And this principle is rationally justified, right? So it's not like we accept this because this is just the way it is. Rationally speaking, these are the books written by Imam Muhammad for the purpose of disseminating the views of Imam Abu Hanifa, and have been transmitted by numerous Hanafi scholars. And all these later mukhtasars that we're going to talk about after, inshallah, that come are more or less summarizing these works, and then the subsequent commentary done on these mukhtasars, which go back to the books of Zahiri riwayah. Therefore, naturally, this is the strongest or most authentic avenue into knowing the thought and ideas of Imam Abu Hanifa. Every other source which goes against, right, the Zahiri riwayah would naturally be dismissed or interpreted in light of it. And even if there is in some cases where it's not in Zahiri riwayah, but the mas'ala attributed to Imam Abu Hanifa goes against the general usul, right, the method that is found by Imam Abu Hanifa in Zahiri riwayah, there in those cases the usul of Zahiri riwayah may be given preference. I'll give you one quick example because we don't have time. Is like, it is known by when you read the books of Zahiri riwayah that the usul of Imam Abu Hanifa when it comes to miqdar, when it comes to estimating amounts, so like, what is considered as ma'ul kabir, right, what is considered as excessive, najasa or something, right, fuhash, some of these words come up, then the usul that Imam Abu Hanifa kind of operates on is al-mufawwad ila ra'yi mubtala bihi, that the deciding factor would go back to the one who is being afflicted by that situation. So if you do get a case where there's miqdar involved and you get a attribution which is fixating on something, saying it's this amount, a fixed number, then the usul of Zahiri riwayah, many ulama will say, well, the method of Imam Abu Hanifa is not to give fixed amounts, so therefore that may be given preference over a rough estimation given from a non-Zahiri riwayah source. So that can be an example of the silence of Zahiri riwayah going against a text which comes in a non-Zahiri riwayah. And we'll look at another example about the raising of the finger in Salah, which can also be applied. But anyway, so the books of Zahiri riwayah, as we read last lesson, from Ahmed Naqib, and this is also mentioned by Ibn Abidin in his very famous book Uqud Rasul Mufti. So Uqud Rasul Mufti by Ibn Abidin, he also mentions the usul laid down that we're going to basically be discussing, and he says that the books of Zahiri riwayah are 6, and because he mentioned 6 and others as well, numerous, that has become like the go-to opinion that the books of Zahiri riwayah are actually 6, and not much debate has come about against that. So you may hear this a lot, books of Zahiri riwayah 6. This comes back to a few scholars before, but what makes it very popular and becomes more like as being the opinion is the fact that Ibn Abidin mentions his book Uqud Rasul Mufti, and this is the go-to study book manual for usul ifta. But Sheikh Lu'ay al-Khalili demonstrates in his book that, which I just cited, that in actuality the books of Zahiri riwayah are 5. Right, now this ikhtilaf, whether it's 6 or 5, doesn't have any material impact. What does that mean? That there is no thamara to this khilaf, right? What's this concept I'm talking about? Is that a person can differ with someone. So I can say, I disagree with you that X is actually Y, right? So you claim this is X. I said, no, it's not X, it's Y. But the significance of that khilaf will only go back to if there is any thamara to it, is any fruit to this khilaf. Does it have any implication? If it does have implication, then our khilaf matters, so then we should try to resolve it or try to refute one opinion of the other. If there is no thamara to it, in the sense that it has no material outcome, it makes no difference in any meaningful way, then that khilaf that doesn't have thamara doesn't require that same form of, forcefulness or refutation. And so this is from amongst them. Why so? Is because the ikhtilaf about whether Zahir Riwayah 6 or 5 is whether Sir Saghir is a separate book or is a part or is a chapter of Kitab al-Asl. If you say it's a separate book, then Zahir Riwayah becomes 6. If you say it's part of Kitab al-Asl, the Zahir Riwayah becomes 5. But in whatever the case, Sir Saghir is, whether it's a chapter or not, is Zahir Riwayah. So by saying that it's 5 or saying that it's 6, it has no meaningful outcome where someone would say, oh, but this is from the 6th book of Zahir Riwayah and you don't accept it. It doesn't work like that. Because everyone accepts these texts to be Zahir Riwayah. It's just whether that is considered from the 6th or the 5th. But anyway, you can read Sheikh Lu'ay al-Khalili's introduction, inshallah, where he goes into more detail regarding the history of Zahir Riwayah and what scholars had debated. But usually these 5 then, and he argues quite convincingly that the Sir Saghir is actually a chapter of Kitab al-Asl. So what are these books? You have Kitab al-Asl. The whole book is available except for the following babs. So the full book of Kitab al-Asl, which is the most important book, is the largest from the Zahir Riwayah, was published in 2012. So the whole thing is available except for specific chapters. What chapters are they? You have Sajadat, Manasik, Ashriba, Adab al-Qadi, Hisab al-Wisaya, Ikhtilaf Abi Hanifa ibn Abi Layla, and Shurut. Right, so that means even the Kitab al-Hajj, it's important to know, is not available in Kitab al-Asl. Initially published by Abu al-Wafa al-Afghani, but he only did a quarter of the work. The Manasik, the chapter on Hajj, was taken from Hakim al-Shahid al-Kafi. So basically there was a Mukhtasar of Kitab al-Asl by al-Hakim al-Shahid, and in it he done Ikhtisar of Kitab al-Hajj, Kitab al-Manasik. So when they published it initially, part of Kitab al-Asl, when they came to Hajj chapter, they just took the Mukhtasar al-Kafi. Of course, the original was not available. Recently, the complete version was published. That's in 2012 in Beirut, Badar ibn Hazm, edited by Dr. Bunya Kalin, who is a Turkish scholar who spent 15 years or so in working on this. And it's an amazing edition, and it's a very, very useful first volume. So anyone's interested in some of these discussions that we're having, and we will have, inshallah, the first volume of Kitab al-Asl has a very useful introduction by Sheikh al-Bunya Kalin. The second book of Zahir Riwayah is Al-Jami' Saghir. Al-Jami' Saghir has been published twice alongside different commentaries. One is with Lakhnawi's commentary Nafi al-Kabir, published in Karachi by Idarat al-Quran wa Ulum Islamiyya. The other is Ibn Maz's commentary, known as Sadr al-Shahid, who died in 536 Hijri. That's published in Beirut. Darul Qutb al-Ilmiya published it. Recently has been published by Bunya Kalin, the same one who published Kitab al-Asl, via Dar ibn Hazm. The book was written after al-Asl. Then you have Al-Jami' al-Kabir, was written after Jami' Saghir. This is published in Hyderabad, Lajna Ihya Ma'arif Nu'maniyya, under Abu Rafal Afghani, under his Ishraf, and also published in Beirut. Darul Qutb al-Ilmiya republished it in 2000 under the editing of Dr. Muhammad Nasir. Then you have Ziyadat, which is the 4th book of Zahir Riwayah. He wrote this after Jami' al-Kabir, Imam Muhammad, is an extra masail missed in Jami' al-Kabir. He then wrote Ziyadat, which are missed masail in the Ziyadat. The latter has been published alongside the commentary of Al-Sarakhsis and Al-Attabi. This is published by Hyderabad, Lajna Ihya Ma'arif Nu'maniyya, edited by Abu Rafal Afghani. It was republished by Alim al-Kutub in 1986. Qadi Khan's commentary on Ziyadat was published with the Tahqiq of Mufti Taqiy's nephew in 6 volumes. The problem here is that the Ziyadat is merged with the Sharh. This is called Damj. It's when the matan and the commentary are merged together, where it's very hard to know which what is what. Claims of manuscript of it are actually commentaries or muntakhabs. So Sheikh Lu'ay said that the claims that he's seen of people having the original in manuscript form is actually commentaries or muntakhabs of it, not the actual original. Asir al-Kabir, last book of Imam Muhammad. Similarly, the original book is lost. It's published alongside the commentary of Sarakhsi, but it also has a problem with the matan being merged with the Sharh. This is published in 1987 by Darul Qutb al-Ilmiya in 5 volumes. It's a more recent edition now as well. Asir al-Saghir is in fact, and the last one, 6th one, which is said to be Asir al-Saghir, is actually a chapter of Kitab al-Asl. There's more to say here. Well, we'll stop on that point, inshallah, and then we'll talk about some of the other books of Imam Muhammad in more detail, and then we'll go on to Nawadir, the last section, Nawadir, and the Fatawa Mashayikh, inshallah. Right, so that was interesting. introduction to the books of Zahiri Riwaya in terms of the publication as well. There may be a few that came out more recently. I've not kind of updated it, but that's from the list that I've made a couple of years ago. The other books of Imam Muhammad, which we did speak about in the previous episode, call it episode if you like, or lecture. I didn't mention the publications. I'm quickly going to go through that. So other books of Imam Muhammad include the Kitab al-Athar. This was published a while back, republished in 1983, edited by Abu al-Wafa al-Afghani. You will hear that name a lot. It was incomplete. It's up to Babu Ziyarat al-Qubur. So it's very useful because of the extensive footnotes that come by Abu al-Wafa al-Afghani in it. It's in one bulky volume, one small volume. But it's incomplete. It goes up to Babu Ziyarat al-Qubur. And there's another print published in the name of Fiqh Muhammad Hassan Shaybani, Al-Musamma Kitab al-Athar, edited by Ahmed Isa al-Mu'sarawi in 2008. And then you have the edition by Darul Nawadir in Damascus, edited by Sheikh Khalid Awad. The latter two actually have gradings and takhrij of the narrations as well, which are very useful. Khalid Awad has actually published numerous other works as well. So these are those three editions that I've seen, I've got. Then you have Al-Hujjah al-Ahl Medina, published a while back, but republished by Al-Mukutub Beirut, edited by Sayyid Mehdi Hassan Al-Kilani. This is in either 4 volumes or 2 bulky volumes. And again, you have extensive footnotes by the editor. This was worked closely again by Abu al-Wafa al-Afghani, who's based in Hyderabad. He published a number of these early Hanafi texts. And then you have the Muwatta bi riwayatihi, meaning riwayat Imam Muhammad. This has been published numerous times. Usually you see it cited alongside its famous, relatively recent commentary by Abdul Hayy al-Laknawi. When I say recent, I mean 120 some 30 years, 140, 50 years ago. So that's called At-Ta'liq al-Mumajjad. Right, Ta'liq al-Mumajjad, which is a commentary on the Muwatta Imam Malik bi riwayat Imam Muhammad by Maulana Abdul Hayy al-Laknawi. So a lot of the editions that you see people study or use, it would be with the ta'liqat, the footnotes of Maulana Abdul Hayy al-Laknawi. There's a recent edition of this out again. And these books are not considered to be Zahiri Riwaya. Right, these books are not considered to be Zahiri Riwaya. There's 2 things to consider here. Number 1 is the fact that these are not books of Masail. So you see a lot of these books have a lot of narrations in them. And to be fair, most of the Masail that may be mentioned, you already find within Zahiri Riwaya anyway. Right, so for example, if you are looking at, I don't know, a topic like Raf' al-Yadayn or something, right, and you find in Kitab al-Athar, you will find it in Zahiri Riwaya anyway. So there isn't much implication, but that being said, it's not that it has zero impact. So where does it actually stack up? Because when it comes to Taqsim al-Masail, we usually divide them up into Zahiri Riwaya and then straight to Nawadir. We'll talk about Nawadir in a second. But these books, where do they stack up? So a lot of the earlier scholars who kind of divide the Masail don't mention where these will fall under. There's actually very recently Sheikh Abu Zahra, who dies in 1974, the famous Egyptian scholar. He said these texts should be mulhaq bi Zahiri Riwaya, that you kind of attach it to Zahiri Riwaya, then these, and then the Nawadir that we will discuss inshallah. And there are some cases in which a mas'ala has come in these texts but has not come in Zahiri Riwaya. So I briefly alluded to it already. So you have the mas'ala of raising the finger in salah, in tashahhud. So raising the finger in tashahhud is not mentioned in Zahiri Riwaya. Because of its absence in Zahiri Riwaya, numerous Hanafi scholars said then that one should not raise their finger in salah in tashahhud. So ishara is not done. But in the Muwatta Imam Malik, bi riwayat Imam Muhammad, if I'm not mistaken, Imam Muhammad mentions the raising of the finger narration and affirms it. So therefore, it's not in Zahiri Riwaya. So technically this will not be within the taqsim, but when a later scholars saw that this was mentioned in one of these books, they also cited it therein. Another example is of the beard. The mas'ala of the beard, or the hukm of the beard, doesn't come in Zahiri Riwaya. It actually doesn't even come in Nawadir. But in Kitab al-Athar, Imam Muhammad, the Imam Abu Hanifa narrates the hadith via Ibrahim Nakha'i. He narrates the hadith of Ibn Umar anhuma. He would hold his beard and he would trim what is below it. And Imam Muhammad said, وَبِهِ نَأْخُذ. This is the opinion that we take. So they're debating on whether there's wujub or whatever, but the opinion of Imam Muhammad of the Imam Abu Hanifa of trimming the beard up to a fist is justified. Whether the fist is wajib or not is a different question, but that is actually found in one of these texts, but it's not found in Zahir Riwayah. And there are other cases, but they're not, as far as I'm aware, it's not numerous masail, but there are some masail like this which are relevant. So these books I mentioned are not Zahir Riwayah, but recently I said Abu Zahra said you can mulhaq with Zahir Riwayah, but it's something to keep in mind of. But there's not going to be much thamara except for the few masail that I mentioned, unless someone produces research to suggest something to the contrary. All the books that we have mentioned attributed to Imam Hanifa are not books of fiqh. So all the books attributed to Imam Hanifa are not books of fiqh. We discussed these books, which are like the books of Aqidah. We discussed that last lecture. The published books of Abu Yusuf are the following. You have Kitab al-Kharaj. This has been published multiple times. There's no need to mention. There's numerous editions of this. You have his book Ikhtilaf Abi Hanifa wa Ibn Abi Layla. This was published in Hyderabad. Again, Lajnatu Ihya Ma'arif Nu'maniyya, edited by Abu Wafa al-Afghani. Same individual. Just a nice, interesting point about Abu Wafa al-Afghani. He was from the ulama al-Uzzam, from the scholars that never married. There's an entry of him in Shaykh al-Fatah Bughda's famous book. It's also published at the end of Al-Qarabisi's Al-Furuq. This edition is the same as Al-Wafa, Abu Wafa, but has the tahqiq and corrections of Ahmed Farid Mazidi. See Qarabisi As'adi Muhammad Al-Furuq fil Furu' Beirut Dar al-Qutb al-Miyya. Then another book, Imam Ikhtilaf Abi Hanifa ibn Abi Layla of his is published. They have Ar-Rad ala Sir Awza'i. We mentioned this last lecture. Again, published in Hyderabad. Lajnat Ihya Ma'a Nu'maniyya, under the edited by Abu Wafa al-Afghani again. And then you have his Kitab al-Athar. Again, this was published by Abu al-Afghani. This has been republished by Dar al-Qutb al-Miyya. Dar al-Qutb, don't be confused, Dar al-Qutb al-Miyya has republished that. Then Dar al-Qutb in Peshawar have done another edition of this work with the tahqiq of an individual by the name of Sheikh Saud Uthman. He has done hukm of the hadith. He's actually graded the hadith as well, which is useful because Abu Wafa al-Afghani does not grade the isnads. This edition does grade the isnad. As I mentioned, Imam Abu Yusuf's work doesn't have any kalam, any discussion, but just the narrations. So I believe that there's more narrations in the Kitab al-Athar Abu Yusuf, but there's not any comments or hardly any comments of Imam Abu Yusuf therein. Imam Muhammad, along with the Zahir Riwayah, has the following books published. Muwatta Imam Malik by Al-Hujjah Al-Madina, Kitab al-Athar. These are the ones that have been published and we just mentioned. So that in a nutshell, we mentioned these books, we just mentioned the publications now, but the books of Zahir Riwayah have been highlighted. The secondary books have been highlighted as well. But this position of mulhaq with Zahir Riwayah is not found in the early books of Usul al-Ifta or when they discuss this, because of the fact that these books were not really part of the curriculum, these secondary books we're talking about, of studying fiqh, because they're mainly evidences to defend the Hanafi position rather than trying to produce fiqh or mention the furu'. Right? So this is why they have not been mentioned. We can also there's been discussions about the asanid of these works. These have been presented as well and can be looked at, but for our purposes we're not going to be delving into that right now. And one work which is probably going to be mentioned here, as cited before, was the book of Isa ibn Aban, but this is a book of usul. Right? This book of Isa ibn Aban, who's the student Imam Muhammad, is a book of usul which is known as Al-Hujj al-Saghir. This was published in defense of the Hanafi madhab, but again, this is not a book of masail, it's a book of usul, and there doesn't seem to be any new masail or tafri' done by Imam Isa ibn Aban. So this allows us to move on to what is known as nawadir. The nawadir, as the name suggests, it means something which is rare. So what nadir means, something unique or rare. And the reason why we have this is that these are those masail which go back to the three imams. Right? So they go back to Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Abu Yusuf, or Imam Muhammad, but not via the routes that are known. Right? They don't go via the routes that are, they don't go via Zahir Riwayah. They go via these other sources which transmit their positions of these three, or one of these three imams. So this is why they are called nawadir, and they hold the second tier within the Hanafi taqsim. And the reason why they hold a second tier is because, one, they don't have the popularity, they're nawadir, as the name suggests, and a lot of the times these are individual masail which have been transmitted, in contrast to Zahir Riwayah where you get context. So you understand Imam Abu Hanifa's mas'ala or his opinion in a wider context of masail, So because the way, like I say, Kitab al-Asl works is you start off with a question against Abu Hanifa, and then the mas'ala extrapolates, and you can actually understand the thought process. In Nawadir, these tend to be odd answers given to specific questions and transmissions which don't have the same context as as the Zahiri Riwayah have. Therefore, they have a second tier in the hierarchy in the Taqsim Masail. So in the last segment, we'll go through what are some of the Nawadir, and then we'll discuss lastly the Fatawa of the Mashayikh, inshallah. Okay, so let's move on to our last section. So we can kind of elaborate on what the Nawadir are. So it's important to note that the Nawadir, as in these, so they tend to be students of Imam Muhammad, Imam Abu Yusuf, and they basically ask them questions of transmitted masail from them on specific given issues, right? So they transmit masail from them on specific given issues. These are like imla, what they call them amali, dictations. And so these are what they kind of transmit on their own, and the majority of these books, in whatever original format they had it in, are lost. But you find a lot of the early books of Hanafi fiqh do preserve a lot of these opinions. So they'll say bi riwayati fulan an Abi Yusuf wa fi riwayatin an Abi Hanifa. You see these come up a lot. These riwayat tend to go back to these sources, but these original sources don't seem to be available in terms of the actual book, but the content, a lot of them are preserved in later authors who actually had access to them. So these are riwayat to the Imams of the Madhab not found in the Zahiri Riwayah. There are a host of books. The only one that I am aware of, and maybe there's been more recent studies I have not looked into, but from when I was writing my notes for this, the one I'm aware of which has been worked on is the Nawadir of Mu'alla ibn Mansur al-Razi. Mu'alla ibn Mansur al-Razi is actually a thiqa rawi of hadith, very popular narrator of hadith, was a student of Imam Abu Yusuf. So his Nawadir of Mu'alla ibn Mansur, who died in 211 Hijri, is the only one that I've seen that's available and has been published as part of an MA dissertation in 2006. This was then has been printed and published as well, not published, so printed and sold. But I don't think it's been published into a proper book yet, and I don't think it's complete. I think it's the chapters of Bayu. I've got a copy of it. It's been a while since I've sieved through it, but you can go online and you can see the nature of these kind of masail. And I think it's just some chapters on Bayu, if I'm not mistaken, and that can be available. The non-available works of Nawadir include, these are from lists that scholars have gleaned from the various sources in the Hanafi text. So you have the Nawadir of Ibrahim ibn Rustum, who died in 211, the Nawadir of Bishr ibn Walid, who died in 238, Nawadir of Dawood ibn Rushayd, who died in 239, Nawadir of Muhammad al-Sama'a, died in 233, the Nawadir of Ibn Shuja', who died in 266, the Nawadir of Musa al-Juzjani, who died after 200, Nawadir of Hisham al-Razi, who died in 201, the Amali of Abu Yusuf, these are like the dictation of Abu Yusuf, the Mujarrad of Hasan ibn Ziyad. It's a very popular text where you find a lot of the Masail from Abu Hanifa by Hasan ibn Ziyad Lu'lu'i. The Mujarrad is also considered from the Nawadir. And you have the Jurjaniyat, Al-Haruniyat, Al-Raqiyat, which are various transmissions of Imam Muhammad's Masail. So these are what are known as the Nawadir. So when you are studying Hanafi fiqh, you will see some of these works being mentioned, and sometimes people ask them, where is this book? The chances are that these works you'll not gain access to, but they have been cited by, or people had access to them once upon a time, and for whatever reason these original works were lost. I want to mention here is that there's a book written by Ahmed Shamsi which talks about the printing press and how the publication of books, the shift it had on the Muslim world. And one of the things that he notes is that a lot of the later scholars, they start to suffice. So this idea of going back to the original was kind of lost in a lot of the fuqaha, and they sufficed on what was mentioned in the later text. So you find like books like Kitab al-Asl, the original of it was hardly utilized for centuries, such that even Ibn Abidin, despite him being the bibliophile that he was of the Hanafi madhab, from Sheikh Lu'ay demonstrates that he didn't have access directly to Kitab al-Asl. Every citation of Kitab al-Asl came via another source. So all his he had to use a source to gain Kitab al-Asl. And so a lot of these original sources, because the content was preserved, you find that a lot of scholars were not too bothered or whatever reason keen to go and look for the original, because they didn't see the purpose in it. So it's just practical, because fiqh is about practicality. So you don't really have this kind of notion of trying to preserve these originals Maybe they will start to come to light now, seeing that so many books are getting published in Turkey. So maybe some of these works will become accessible. But Allah knows best. But a lot of these works were not readily utilized or were available in libraries for the Hanafi jurists. And this is something found in other works as well, where a lot of these earlier classics no one really has access to. So even like books like Kitab al-Umm of a Shafi'i, if you were to go 200 years ago, the chances of a Shafi'i reading Kitab al-Umm will be more rare. The chances are that we're looking at the books of Rafi'i or Nawawi, etc., because they kind of preserve them and they do the job for them and they utilize these texts. So if someone asks why are these books no longer available, then the answer is that a lot of the later sources kind of sufficed the jurist, so they didn't necessarily bother with trying to preserve these classics. Allah knows best. It's just a theory. May have truth to it, may not do. So that's the Nawadir. So that's a second tier. As I mentioned, is mentioned by what's his name? Ibn Abidin and others as the second tier. In Taqsim al-Masail, Lakhnani mentions this as well. Then we can move on to what is known as the Fatawa Mashayikh. Fatawa Mashayikh are based, these are Mashayikh. So these names that we mentioned, the Nawadir, their opinions and maybe their students' opinions, these are the Mashayikh of the Madhab. And this is where Imam Abu Hanifa says something, Sahibain from Zahiri Riwayat, then you have Nawadir, and then you have this early tier of Hanafi Mashayikh, their opinions. Now these opinions may come in contrast to what Abu Hanifa Sahibain have said. Right, so you say they said this and the Mashayikh said this. This could be further tafri'. So Abu Hanifa says Sahibain says this, and based upon that they say X. Or it could be the earlier sources haven't said anything and these Mashayikh have said something. Right, so the general rule will be, if Zahiri Riwayat comes first. No Zahiri Riwayat, then you go to Nawadir. No Nawadir, then you go to Fatwa Mashayikh. If there's something in Fatwa Mashayikh and not in the previous two sources, then generally fatwa will be given upon that, because that's seen as the most purest of mas'ala we have within the madhab. There are complications surrounding that, but that's what we have. Now, who plays a pivotal role in this? And the Fatwa Mashayikh are going to be these fatwa that they've written during their time or given. You'll find them scattered throughout various early Hanafi sources, but probably the most famous and important source when it comes to Fatwa the Mashayikh is written by Abu Layth al-Samarqandi. So Abu Layth al-Samarqandi dies in the year 373, a prolific Hanafi author, written numerous works. I'll mention some of his other works before I go to his main work that we're looking at. He has, for example, Bahr al-Ulum, which is his tafsir, which was published in 1985 with an introduction and annotation by Abdul Rahim Ahmed Zaqqa, who argues that the name Bahr al-Ulum was given to it after the author's time. This edition consists of 3 volumes covering until the end of Surah An'am and is prefaced by a valuable introduction by the editor. A later edition of it is published as Tafsir al-Samarqandi, Al-Musamma Bahr al-Ulum by Ali Muhammad Muawwid, Adil Ahmed Mawjood, Abdul Majid Al-Nuti. These 3, they're published in 3 volumes in Beirut, Darul Qut Ilmiya. And another edition of it is Tafsir al-Samarqandi, edited by Mahmoud Mutarji in 3 volumes, Beirut, Darul Fikr. This is information is taken from Mufti Abdul Rahman's dissertation, I'll talk about in a second. And then you have other books such as Uyun al-Masail and Khizan al-Fiqh. This work has been published together with Khizan al-Fiqh, Baghdad, Sharikat al-Tabu' wa-Nashr, Ahliya, edited by Salahuddin al-Nahi, 1965. There are 2 other books by the same name by Hanafi scholars, one by Radiuddin Shams Ayman Ahmed al-Sarakhsi and Abdullah ibn Ahmed al-Balkhi. Then he gives citations for that. So this information about this has been taken from Mufti Abdul Rahman's PhD dissertation. And Mufti Abdul Rahman's PhD dissertation is the book that we're going to talk about briefly. It's known as Fatawa Nawazil. Right, one of the most important books of Al-Samarqandi is called Fatawa Nawazil. This was initially published by Darul Qut Ilmiya, but it turned out that they actually published Al-Marghinani's book and mistakenly attributed to Abu Layth al-Samarqandi. So this was initially published with the name Fatawa Nawazil. And they had thought they had published Abu Layth al-Samarqandi's book, when in actual fact they had published, I think it's Mukhtarat al-Nawazil of Imam Marghinani, the author of Hidayah. So in essence, this book had not been published. Then for the first time the work was actually made available, was by a PhD dissertation in 2013 by Mufti Abdul Rahman, one who's teaching you guys as well. But only a part of it was worked on. So Mufti Sahib didn't publish he didn't work on the whole text. was not made available the whole text. I think he did work on the whole text, but he didn't make available the whole text. He only critically edited some of it, and there's a lengthy introduction there where he talks about Abu Samarqand. This is available online. So if you just write Abdurrahman Mangera, Abu Samarqandi, or Fatawa Nawazil on SOAS, where he worked on this, it will come up and you can read the introduction and he goes into it, the work. Then the work was published in its complete form in 2017 by Darqut Ilmiya, edited by Muhammad Salim Hashim, but they have entitled it as Fatawa min Aqawil al-Mashayikh fil Ahkam al-Shar'iyyah. They changed the name, I think, not to get confused with the previous Fatawa Nawazil inaccurately published. So it's published in the name of Fatawa min Aqawil al-Mashayikh fil Ahkam al-Shar'iyyah. So this is the text. This is based upon, I believe, one manuscript. Muftis have done it on 4, and so the whole thing has been typed up in one bulky volume. This book is very useful. Many of the fatwa of the early Hanafis is recorded therein, upon which many later masail are based. So here you're going to find a lot of these fatwa of these early mashayikh, where you don't necessarily get mention of it from the books of Zahiri Riwaya or Nawadir. Now, how are you supposed to approach this fatwa? Some scholars would have a bit more, if it's there, we'll give fatwa on it. Others would sometimes look at that within the light of the wider usul as stipulated within the madhab. One example of this, for example, I'll give you an example. So in Hanafi Fiqh, you will read that it is impermissible for women to cut their hair. It's impermissible for women to cut their hair. And this is taken from a fatwa given by, I believe it's Abu Bakr Iskaf, and this comes in Fatah Nawazi, where he says that it's not permissible for women to cut their hair because there's no obedience for the creator, even if the husband says so, because there's no obedience for the creation in disobedience of the creator. So this is by Abu Bakr Iskaf. He mentions this fatwa, and numerous Hanafis then mention this later on. There is no explicit mention of this from Imam Hanifa or Sahibain, not in Zahiri Riwaya, nor in Nawadir. So a lot of Hanafis just took it as saying, because it comes up from the Fatah Mashayikh who give it. You see sometimes recent now Hanafis, they will try to understand the Fatwa and Usul, saying, why is that the case? If it's the Shawb bin Rijal, then what if they cut the hair and there's not the Shawb bin Rijal? So you start to qualify that fatwa, but this is an example of, and there are a few others as well, and we can look at those in more detail. We'll look at case studies inshallah, but for now that would fulfill our purpose of the free taqsim. So in this lesson, you should take away with us is that there are 3, or we can say 3.5 if you want, right? There's 3 tiers, 3.5 tiers within the Hanafi madhab. You have Zahiri Riwaya, which have 5 books of Imam Muhammad. Some mentioned 6. We discussed the differences there. Then you have the Mulhaq bi Zahiri Riwaya, which is mentioned by Abu Zahra, which are the works written by Imam Muhammad, which are not Masail, which are not basically in Zahiri Riwaya but are from there. So this should have a second tier, because we know that Imam Muhammad wrote this. They have context to it as well. Then you have these Nawadir, and the reason why Nawadir have a second, they come in a second category is because they tend to not have those contexts, and they're not transmitted with the same popularity and with that wide acceptance as the Zahiri Riwaya were. So therefore, if Nawadir and Zahiri Riwaya clash, or Zahiri Riwaya gives preference, or the Nawadir will have to be understood in light of Zahiri Riwaya or the Usul of Zahiri Riwaya. And then the books of Nawadir, as you mentioned, the only one that I'm aware that's available is the Nawadir of Mu'allab al-Mansur, the student Imam Abu Yusuf. And this and the other Nawadir, they are preserved, like the Mujarrad of Hasan al-Ziyad, etc., are preserved in earlier Hanafi texts. But the originals, Allah knows best, maybe they would come to light, but I have not seen any of them published. Maybe they are accessible, Allah Ta'ala knows best. So that's the first 2 tiers. And then the third tier is the tier of Fatawa the Mashayikh. These are the early Mashayikh of the Madhab, their opinions. And one of the great books that kind of preserves a lot of this is the book of Abu Samarqandi, which is known as Fatawa Nawazil. And again, you have books like Muhit al-Burhani, Ibn Mazah, where they also cite the opinions of some of these Mashayikh, which they have preserved. So those are the 3 tiers. Inshallah, then once we understand that, then we can look at next lesson, which is the Taqsim al-Mujtahideen, or Taqsim al-Fuqaha, which is the division then of the jurists. And then once we have the division of jurists, then we can look at the understanding of the Mu'tabar and non-Mu'tabar books of the Madhab, which come after these 3 tiers. And we explain why that is a important phenomena. So that's what we're going to be looking at in the next two sessions. Once that is covered, inshallah, then we can start to look at, we can start doing case studies and looking at various other questions. So a lot of the theory that we're reading about, we can start looking at practical examples. So we'll stop here. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.